Good evening. The National Benevolent Association and Reconciliation Ministry of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ are proud to offer a three-part webinar series focused on congregational and general church involvement in prison and jail ministries. Today's topic is mass incarceration and the returning citizen, tools to equip congregations to respond, welcome, and engage. During this webinar, we will share information about the overcrowded prison situation in the United States, the rates of recidivism, and we'll also discuss how to become a welcoming and hospitable congregation and the importance of working behind the bars and then beyond the bars. We will offer a brief introduction of two organizations, Prison Congregations of America and Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, who are currently leaders in the work of reentry. Additionally, we will share the importance of advocacy and why you should consider participating in this year's Ecumenical Advocacy Days National Gathering in Washington, D.C., taking place on April 17th through 20th, 2015. During this webinar, we invite you to use the live group chat feature on the bottom of your screen to submit any questions. If you are participating by phone, you may email your questions to mkilpatrick@nbacares.org. Again, that's mkilpatrick@nbacares.org. And after the presentation, we will address as many questions as possible. If your question is not answered here, we will follow up with you via email. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for future use. So to begin, let me introduce our speakers. The Reverend Dean W. Bucalis, ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, is presently serving as the pastor of New Life in Christ Christian Church Disciples of Christ. This is a congregation which he began inside a women's reentry facility in Louisville, Kentucky. He is also the program coordinator of Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, an ecumenical reentry program that trains small faith-based groups to work with ex-offenders upon their release from prison. Dean is a trained facilitator for the Juvenile Justice Pilot Program in Jefferson County, Kentucky, which is sponsored by Restorative Justice Louisville, and he's MBA's program coordinator for prison and jail ministries. Reverend April G. Johnson serves as the Minister of Reconciliation for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. She brings to this work a deep passion for racial justice and compassion. As Minister of Reconciliation, Reverend Johnson facilitates the church-wide process of awareness and action toward healing the fractures in the body of Christ caused by systemic racism. She collaborates with trained facilitators, regional and general staff leadership, and ecumenical partners to guide the church's effort toward reconciliation. In her capacity as both pastor and administrator, Reverend Johnson emphasizes the importance of relationship building across difference to promote pro-reconciliation as a guiding principle of the church's global witness. At this time, I will turn the conversation over to April and Dean.
Well,
thank you, Monica.
And thank you for joining us. Dean?
We want to begin with kind of a context for this particular webinar. One of the issues that we have that continues to affect not only our churches but all of our neighborhoods is we've got a problem in our country. We've got a broken correction system. I don't think that's something that is a new revelation to many people. But we realize right now that the United States has more people who are incarcerated per capita than any other country in the world. We wonder how that has come about, and there's no one simple answer to that. Some of it is a failed drug war. Some of it is enhancement penalties that have been instituted in our criminal justice system. Some of it has just been a tough on crime policy that has continued to incarcerate more and more people over the last 15 to 20 to 30 years even. The statistics are rather staggering when we look at them and break them down. 1 out of every 31 Americans is either in prison, jail, or under some type of supervised release. And even more frightening, I suspect, than that, and more sobering and more disturbing is that 60% of those who are incarcerated in the United States are people of color. That is a disproportionate number compared to the number of people of color in our country at this time. So we've got a problem, and the context of this particular webinar is what can our churches and our congregation members do in order to address this particular problem that continues to affect our country and our communities.
Well, you go ahead, Dee. Go ahead. Well, I want to
One of the
say,
things that we're going to be talking about
oh,
is that
sorry.
and the definition of that is relatively simple, although not known by a lot of people. It's the act of re-engaging in criminal offenses despite having been punished. And basically what correction people do, they look at studies over a period of usually 3 years, and they try to determine the percentage of people who are rearrested or reconvicted or returned to custody. And it, once again, a very staggering figure. 40% of those people who have been incarcerated are likely to return to some type of incarceration within a 3-year period. One study actually looks at that as a 43.3% of the people who were released in prison in 2004 ended up back in some place of incarceration. What we find is that the recidivism rate has a lot of different causations. One of those is that many of the people who are released from prison return to dysfunctional communities and support groups. Oftentimes they haven't received the type of treatment that they've needed while they've been incarcerated. There are a lack of employment opportunities for people once they get back onto the streets and into their communities. And oftentimes they have difficult times finding adequate, safe, and affordable housing. They also frequently return to addictive behavior because they haven't completely moved through a process of recovery. And then a number of people are back in prison because of parole violations. So the recidivism rate really tells us that really 4 to 5 people who are released from prison are back within 3 years has created as well a problem for our communities. When we look at the people who are incarcerated, the statistics there are also rather staggering. 95% of the people who are incarcerated presently will be released at some point. Some of those will be released under supervision. Others will have served out their sentences. And where they're going? Well, they're coming back into our communities. We refer to this as reentry. When somebody comes back into our community, a returning citizen after they've been incarcerated, whether it's been through parole or probation or having served out their sentence, they return to either their community or another community in which they seek to relocate. The problems of reentry are very similar to the same problems that cause the rate of recidivism to be so high. When people go back into their communities, oftentimes they have the same difficulties of housing and employment and finding medical care and clothing. When people are released from prison, oftentimes they're released with very little money and very few resources. And so what we have to determine is how we can begin to change this cycle of recidivism so that people are not continuing to go through this revolving door of returning back into places of incarceration. And how do we keep them into our communities, and how do we help engage them so that they can become productive citizens? They can be good fathers and mothers. They can be supportive spouses and good parents. I believe that one of the missing links in this whole process of successful reentry is our churches. You know, Jesus talked about our being welcoming and meeting people where they are, a way of serving others by trying to find ways in which we can help them to become the children of God that they were created to be. The church has been called to, in many ways, be hospitable and welcoming in a world that has a lot of brokenness. And it's my contention, I think, and many who are in this area of ministry, that one of the missing links has been into successful reentry has been our churches. There are probably more than one right answer to this particular dilemma. What we're going to talk about a little bit is one answer, and it's something that I've been involved with for a number of years, a nonprofit called Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, which is a ministry that meets people behind bars and begins to develop relationships with them, walks across that bridge of reentry with them, and continues to support, nurture, and hold them accountable once they have been released from prison or from jail. So how does that begin? How does that start, and how did we start? Well, one of the ways that we began was by partnering with a group called Prison Congregations of America, which is an ecumenical group that helps denominations plant prison congregations. And that's what we did in Kentucky. We started a prison congregation first inside a men's facility and then later into a women's detention facility with a pastor and worship services on a regular basis, and Bible studies and life skills training classes. And we would invite outside congregations to come in and not only worship, but also to sit alongside those folks who have been incarcerated. So we began behind the bars, and most studies have shown that successful reductions in recidivism and good mentoring programs are ones that actually begin when people are incarcerated and follows them through the process of reentry into communities. We look at what we do as a holistic approach. It looks at the spiritual, emotional, psychological, and physical dimensions of individuals. We're not the only answer, but what we feel is that this is a significant model that can be replicated in a lot of communities. And we're beginning to see success rates when we have people who complete the program, which we'll be describing in just a minute. The recidivism rate is dramatically reduced. So what does that program look like? How does that begin? Well, what we have developed through the model of restorative justice are nurture, support, and accountability groups. What we try to do is we try to train faith-based folks who oftentimes have come into one of the facilities and worship with folks who are part of one of these congregations, developed a relationship with them, began sitting beside them and sharing worship with them and sharing hymnals with them and praying with them, begin to dispel some of the stereotypes that people have about people who are incarcerated, but also that key of beginning to develop relationships with people. And what we've discovered is that this forms a volunteer base where we then train people to form nurture, support, and accountability groups, which are basically groups of about 3 to 5 people. It's a small intentional ministry. And they will work with one person who is released, and they'll walk alongside that person for 6 months to a year, covenanting with that person to meet with them once a week and also to stay in contact with them either through telephone or going out for coffee or text messages every day. And this process continues for 6 months to a year. And when people complete that process, we've discovered that their probability of returning to prison is dramatically reduced. The nurture, support, and accountability groups provide one, nurture, where they provide a safe environment for people who are returning citizens to share some of the concerns they have, some of the frustrations they have. It's a place where unconditional love can be exhibited as well as God's forgiveness and acceptance. But it's more than that. It's actually a mentoring program. We train people. It's a day-long training. And we bring in people from a variety of different backgrounds. These are the folks who then serve as mentors within the context of a nurture, support, and accountability group. They provide teachable moments. They share their life experiences. They equip the returning citizen to become more successful in their reentry process. And what we've discovered is that the relationships deepen, and the mentoring process is one that becomes very successful. And we begin that behind bars, so that this is something that is a continuing relationship. One of the tasks of the Nurture, Support, and Accountability Group is to listen to what goals the returning citizen might have, and to help that person to develop action plans with respect to meeting those goals, but also to talk about some of the frustrations that are inevitable when somebody is returning from prison and going back into their community. Another key part of the Nurture, Support, and Accountability Groups is holding the returning citizen accountable, to setting realistic goals, high expectations, but not those that can't be met. We don't want people to experience more failure. Teach people to live into the consequences of their actions. We try to connect with community resources. By having a mentoring group of 3 to 5 people, we have people who look at situations through different lenses, and they also have different connections and resources in the community. And also the teaching in this context of accountability, it has to do with setting reasonable boundaries with respect to relationships that the returning citizen has, not only with their family members, but with potential employers and other people that they encounter in their everyday life. It's all about building healthy relationships. That's really what Jesus was talking about when he went about his ministry and began calling people to follow him, to develop healthy relationships and positive support groups, so that we can face those difficult times in our lives that sometimes when we go alone, we don't always make the right and healthy decisions. The function of the Nurture, Support, and Accountability Group is really to help equip people to live into the promise that God has had for them all along, to be caring, loving, supporting, compassionate, merciful, forgiving people of God. It's not just the work of the Nurture, Support, and Accountability Groups, though. It's the work of all of our churches and all of our church members. And so the question is, well, how do churches get involved with this? And what are some of the ways in which churches can engage in this particular social justice issue? Well, one of the first aspects of that, and one of the first steps, is really to invite congregation members to visit and worship inside prisons, to begin breaking down some of the barriers and stereotypes and prejudices that the media seems to promulgate, and then to welcome returning citizens when they come into our churches. A lot of stories that I hear from returning citizens when they go back to their home churches or other churches is that when people find out that they have come from an incarcerated situation, that oftentimes the reception is rather cold. And oftentimes the messages are clear that they may not be welcomed into that particular community of faith. The other aspect that helps with welcoming citizens is to understand life of those in prisons, to begin educating ourselves about who these folks are and what some of their issues are, setting protocols for those who come into our congregation who may have been convicted sex offenders, so that the congregation is in a safe place, as well as a safe place for those returning convicted felons. And then training members to be parts of Nurture, Support, and Accountability Group, and exploring the concepts of restorative justice as opposed to the retributive justice that is so prevalent in our society right now. Lots of opportunities for congregations to become more informed and to create hospitable and welcoming places for those who have been on the margins so long. One of the ways in which we begin some of that education process is it's through the study of Michelle Alexander's book. She's written a very powerful piece of literature in this area called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And April's going to talk a little bit about how congregations can resource that and study that. But we're going to be doing another webinar in May. April and I are talk about how congregations can follow a model of study of this particular book that begins opening up some of these conversations, as well as opening up people's lives to the issues of mass incarceration, as well as the dilemmas that returning citizens face. And the other aspect of all of this is engaging in advocacy, and April's going to talk now about opportunities that we have before us to make some changes, to make the world a better place as we address these particular issues.
And well, good evening again. Thank you, Dean. I think Dean's work is so exciting, and I hope we didn't go through it so fast that you didn't find places where you or your congregation can fit in. As Monica said earlier, I do have the privilege to serve as Minister of Reconciliation for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And that, many of you may or may not know, is our mission priority to eradicate the sin of racism out of our practices, policies, that ultimately affect our structures as well as the communities in which we serve. And so what we have found from the general church level is that the pervasiveness of mass incarceration has come to the attention of many of our members in our congregations, to the end that in 2013, one of our congregations proposed what we call an item for research and reflection for consideration by our church-wide gathering at our General Assembly in July of 2013. That proposal was accepted by the church, and it called the church to a period of awareness raising and discernment for mission around this moral imperative called mass incarceration. And so having accepted the item for research and reflection, that process calls for us to first engage in ways that we can learn or bring awareness about the ways in which the impact of the war on drugs has impacted poor communities and as well as communities of color. And so we want to help our congregations to understand through study how the war on drugs has impacted those communities and how we can respond. We also want this discernment period, which ends this July, to learn ways to bring about awareness and relief to those communities. And lastly, we want to help our members in our congregations explore ways in which they might support restoration of human and civil rights, namely for first-time nonviolent offenders. So resourcing our congregations and our church-wide ministries for discernment and mission around the complexities of the sin of racism and models like the one that Dean showed, how we can respond, really is the crux of what we do as reconciliation ministry for the entirety of the church. And it's not possible, though, for us to do that, represent the church, without having collaboration with partners like NBA and other ministry partners throughout the life of the church. I skipped over the recommended resources. So some of those resources you see on this slide here are ways in which we engage our ministry. So we engage the Ministry of Reconciliation through education. We also do it through intentional dialogue. We also address inclusive worship and, as Dean said, through faithful advocacy. So on this page, you see some of the ways in which we try to equip our congregations through education. And we receive our resources for education really by scouring, by talking to, by sharing, and passing on what we have acquired from both secular media, but mostly from our members and our ecumenical partners. And I want to bring to your attention here on the slide, if you can see, A Lesson Before Dying is a book that has been recommended by the Illinois-Wisconsin Regional Anti-Racism Team as a part of the region-wide program called One Book, One Church. And the purpose of that program really is to make accessible this difficult conversation, not only about race, but this difficult conversation about how to understand just what a person's experience of being imprisoned is in a system that continues to be dehumanizing. So, and the last book on this page is a book that I highly recommend by Brian Stevenson, who is an attorney who started his own practice immediately out of law school after having some experience in Southern law advocacy for incarcerated people on death row. to me, it's a quick read, but it's very telling of how our justice system sometimes functions as not a justice system, but a system that is fundamentally broken and inhumane, and the ways in which we, as the faith community, in partnership with the secular community, can respond to help hold our communities accountable to all of its citizens. One of the ways in which we work with our congregations to address this work is through congregation-based organizing initiatives. And these are ecumenical and interfaith partnerships in our communities where disciples congregations are working in partnership. Some of their leaders, sometimes it's the pastor, to advocate for restorative justice mechanisms as an alternative to juvenile detention. Some of these here listed and others have focused on what we call campaigns, which would allow congregations to address the ability for returning citizens to be able to have their rights restored, to be viable, or to gain employment. So the box is that box on the employment application that asks if you have ever been convicted of a felony, which is obviously a very easy way to discriminate and to prevent folks from gaining employment, and as Dean spoke of earlier, then affecting recidivism. And so those are some of the churches that were fit on the slide that are involved in this work. It definitely is not exhaustive. The Interfaith Organizing Initiative is a network of all of the community-based and congregation-based organizing networks that function throughout the country. And they gather at a table to work on shared issues. And racial justice and mass incarceration is one that we chose to work on in 2014. And I offer the website there for you to be able to use as resources if you're going to have conversations in your congregation with regard to how do we enter a dialogue about what are some of the root causes, what was the war on drugs. We have on that website we have about 4 or 5 videos from the speakers that were presented there. Some of those speakers were actual returning citizens that had powerful witnesses in terms of what it means for the faith community to respond. And on the other side there is just an explanation. That's a word that just explains what congregation-based organizing initiatives do. So these are some of the ways to explain it. If you go to the Interfaith Organizing Initiative webpage, you can click on any of these and it will give you some background on things like the Alinsky model. It'll give you some samples on what grant makers are doing around poverty and what folks are doing around training in terms of how you do get involved in community and congregation-based organizing. And so one of the ways in which we also are involved in advocacy is what Monica mentioned in our introduction, the 2015 Ecumenical Advocacy Days. This is an annual event held by our obviously our ecumenical partners, mostly through the National Council of Churches. And this year's theme, so this is just how pervasive mass incarceration is and how pervasive the desire to respond to mass incarceration is, that we have decided to continue in our advocacy around mass incarceration. The theme is breaking the chains and systems of exploitation. So in collaboration with National Benevolent Association, Disciples Center for Public Witness, and the Council on Christian Unity, we will be hosting an event there on this Saturday of, so April, I believe it's April, so next slide, April 18th at 5:15. Yours, Dean, will be one of the presenters at that, and here are some other partners that will be bringing their practitioner expertise to this conversation that we'll be hosting at Ecumenical Advocacy Days. And this is a phenomenal forum for us to be working in collaboration with these both faith and secular partners. So we're very excited about this opportunity also to work with opportunities for sustained advocacy on behalf of mass incarceration. And for more information, you see here, this is the page that gives you contact information for National Benevolent Association and my office. And I just want to lastly say that at Ecumenical Advocacy Days, also we will be working in collaboration with our partner denomination, the United Church of Christ, and we're presenting 2 workshops on how the intersection of racism and incarceration. Those will be 2 90-minute workshops on Saturday and Sunday. And we're just very excited to be, one, presenting at Ecumenical Advocacy Days, but also to continue our justice work in partnership. Monica?
Thank you, April and Dean, for such a powerful presentation and for the host of information. We did have a couple questions that came through during your presentations, and I'd like to throw those over to you now. The first is from Brandon Gilvin, and he asks, how different are recidivism rates for violent and nonviolent offenders? And Dean, that might be for you.
I don't know that there are any studies that have distinguished between recidivism rate for violent or nonviolent offenders. But one of the things that we do in our program, Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, is that we have a screening and application process for people who wish to participate in what we do. And so we tend to try to screen folks that we think would be most appropriate to work with in their peer support and accountability group. There are some that are high-risk offenders. There are some that may be more dangerous with respect to their behavior than others that we tend not to include in this particular model because it's not a model that would be effective with those types of offenders. So we don't know, at least I don't know what the difference with respect to recidivism rate is. A lot of it depends on the type of crime that is committed. We do know that oftentimes, for example, those who are sex offenders, that the recidivism rate for those folks who've been through treatment programs is much lower than the 40% that we have listed for all of the offenders across the country.
Thank you, Dean. And then we have a question from Bonnie Osei Frimpong. Says, what benchmarks have you found or established for welcoming sex offenders into congregations? So how do we welcome sex offenders? It's a challenging
question. When we were at Luther Luckett Correctional Complex, there were about 70% of the residents there had been convicted of sex offenses. Really, they were there because there was a sex offender treatment program there that they were enrolled in. The sex offenders in our culture and society today really are the lepers of what we would think of as the first century culture. The first thing I wanted to say about those who've been convicted of sex offenders is that the term sex offender has a broad and wide breadth to it. So when we think of sex offenders, often we think of pedophiles, which is a small percentage of those who are sex offenders, less than 10%. But there are also people who have been convicted of what we call statutory crimes, those who may be over the age of 18, who have sexual relations with somebody under the age of 18, sometimes unbeknownst to them that the person was under the age of 18. We have incest, we have more violent crimes with respect to rape and domestic violence. So the sex offender label is one that is relatively widespread, and I caution people to make too many stereotypes with respect to somebody who's been labeled as a sex offender without finding out more specifics about that particular person's offense. We have been very successful, actually, in helping integrate sex offenders into congregations. One of the things that we have to be aware of is that oftentimes sex offenders, because of their background, have restrictions with respect to where they can go and what they can do. So frequently they're not permitted to be around children or children's programming. Uh, what I tell congregations when I talk with them about the possibility of working with and welcoming a sex offender is that, in fact, in most of our congregations, there are sex offenders sitting in the pews that we don't know anything about. When sex offenders come from an institution and we recommend that a congregation works with them, one, people will be aware of who they are, and two, we try to help congregations set protocols and boundaries with respect to working with those particular individuals, not only for the protection of the congregation, but also for the protection of individuals themselves. And so what we try to do is we do separate trainings with respect to those who be working with sex offenders. And we found that when those protocols are initiated and instituted, that the success rate for integrating people who have been convicted of sex offenses is relatively positive. If we don't accept those folks in our churches and do that with caution so that we are well educated and well equipped to do that, these folks are not going to be welcome or accepted anywhere. And if the ministry of Jesus taught us anything, it was that we should be welcoming to those who are on the margins and those who have been um, in many ways shunned by the rest of society.
Excellent. We have a question from Nathan Hill. Can you speak to the pastoral care challenges of welcoming a returning citizen back to a small congregation? How can we honor the dignity of the person and limit misunderstandings?
That's a great question. And one of the things that I do when I try to engage congregations that might be working with returning citizen is I try to meet not only with the pastor but also with the eldership of the congregation, so that people are aware, at least the leadership, the spiritual leadership of a congregation, that they are aware of some of the needs that that they need to institute with respect to preparing themselves for welcoming somebody who's a returning citizen. It's a very fine balance. We don't expect or want congregations to single out and point to somebody who's a returning citizen and stigmatize them even more than they already are. On the other hand, we want to make sure that the congregation is not taken aback or is unprepared for working with somebody like that. So generally what we try to do with our nurture, support, and accountability groups is we ask those people to really be the ambassadors to the congregation, to begin informing the congregation, talking with the congregation about what they're doing, how they're surrounding this person and providing this person with support and accountability, always in conjunction with the pastoral leadership of the congregation. That's really key and very important. So it's a great question that you've asked. The other part of that is that what we do know is if in fact those things aren't revealed in some fashion, either through congregational meetings or through newsletters, not necessarily naming a person, but indicating that a congregation is going to be working with a returning citizen, then what often occurs is a very negative and sometimes harsh response from congregation members. What we want to educate people so that they feel equipped and they understand that this is part of our ministry. But we want people to be prepared and to feel comfortable about this aspect of ministry. And if you have other questions about that, I'd love to talk to you, because it really is a very key pastoral care question.
One question I have for April is to knowing that systemic racism is so complex and broad, and there are so many ways, entry points into trying to address that challenge. Why prison and jail issues? Why are we even talking about this? What's the importance as it relates to reconciliation ministry or our commitment to anti-racism and pro-reconciliation?
First thing, two things that come to mind. You mentioned the complexity of racism, and that's why a lot of our resources are vary in terms of their accessibility. There are places where we actually would need to qualify, is this entry level kind of stuff, is this intermediate, is this advanced, because racism is so insidious that we often don't see it at work. And one of the ways in which Reconciliation Ministry is charged to address racism is through its systemic expressions. And so in our partnerships with folks like with Dean's Ministry and other folks in the affiliate ministry, we are raising awareness for folks to understand the difference between individual attitude and behavior and the way in which racism is embedded into our systems, such that racism does not have to be an individual act, but it actually is perpetuated through policies and practices that are in our structures that have been there since we have made laws. And so, but that is not something that's accessible to someone who's just in our pews that's saying, but I'm not a bad person. I'm not, we welcome everyone into our home, and they don't know how something like incarceration rates for a population for the entire country that is approximately and not quite 13% of the national population is 95% of the prison population, and how that is a systemic issue versus a behavioral issue. And so we have to have ways in which we slow walk people into understanding how to see systems as opposed to seeing behavior. And for the most part, we have been all shaped by racism so that we don't see systems. And that's, again, that's not an individual thing, but it's intentionality built into our structures of our laws.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. If there are no more questions at this time, and I don't see any coming through, I want to thank everyone for their participation and ask April and Dean if you have any final comments you'd like to share.
Well, I guess ladies first. I would just say, as I said earlier, in terms of the resources that we offer, we really do share what we hear from what is happening on the ground. And it's very helpful. Like, these questions were very, very helpful for me to know what pastors are dealing with in terms of welcoming the formerly incarcerated back into the community, how to help congregations prepare, like what Dean is doing, to educate congregations so that there can be a strategy in terms of welcoming, but also helping the congregation feel comfortable with what is happening. So please feel free to share with me, Dean, any of the resources that you have found, or more importantly, some of the situations that you are facing, so that we can help you find resources to address.
Thank you, April. One of the things that I'd like to leave folks with is the importance of this type of work. We talk about being a missional church. We talk about trying to meet people where they are and moving from our doorsteps into the world. The reality is that this is a problem that's at our doorsteps right now and in our community. And the church is on the forefront of that and has an opportunity to make tremendous impact, not only in communities, in reducing the perpetuation of crime, but also in creating healthier and more holistic places for people to thrive as children of God. When we talk about statistics of 95% of the people who are incarcerated coming back to our communities, the community is a place that change needs to occur, and the voice of that community and the hands and feet of that community need to be our faith-based communities and those who are following Christ's directions and following Christ's teachings. So there are great opportunities here, and one of the things that I think is so important for our churches is that you don't have to have a big budget to do this kind of ministry. You don't have to be a large church to do this kind of ministry. It just takes a few people who have a passion for this, who feel called to this, to educate themselves, to equip themselves, and to open the doors and to change people's lives. It's a transformative ministry. When I talk to some of the people who have had positive experiences with nurture, support, and accountability groups and with the churches in which they have been welcomed and accepted, they talk about understanding God's grace in a way that they've never understood it before. So we have an opportunity to expand those good things that we're already doing, to move to the margins and welcome people in who are seeking to change their lives and do things in a better and more productive way.
Well, fantastic. Thank you both April and Dean for sharing with us. This ends our Q&A portion of the webinar. Please consider the many ways you and your congregation might get involved and further your ministries to address prison and jail issues. Both the webinar and the PowerPoint slides will be made available after this time. And we want to remind you that registration for Ecumenical Advocacy Days National Gathering held in April the 17th through the 20th in Washington, D.C. is still open. Go to advocacydays.org for more information. As mentioned earlier, a special reception and program co-sponsored by the National Benevolent Association, Reconciliation Ministries, the Disciples Center for Public Witness, and the Council on Christian Unity will be held on Saturday, April 18th, beginning at 5:15. All are welcome, and you do not need to register for the EAD gathering to attend this reception. Last but not least, we invite you to like MBA on Facebook and then visit our MBA webpage and get connected by completing our online form. Look out for more information on all of our events and for our next webinar in May. Thank you and have a great night.